There are many things that happen through our lives that we pay a little attention to, a little more attention to, and a lot of attention to. But one of the things that I think is overlooked is the importance, and the impact of history. And during Black History Month, I'm more than a little humbled to be able to have with me a lady who is a descendant of one of the most noted individual in the history, not only of Macon, not only of the United States, but also internationally. And it's such an intriguing story about William and Ellen Craft it's just an honor for me to be talking to a descendant of those famous runaway slaves who outworked the slave runners and the slave owners. And it's such an interesting story. And we have with us today, as I mentioned, Miss Julia Ellen Craft Davis. This is a call to action.
A call to action.
I'm your host, Alex Habersham. And Miss Davis, how you doing?
I'm great.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. And it's just so good to see somebody who's got that kind of blood running through her veins. And I'm so happy that you thought it would not be robbery for you to tell the story of your great-great-grandparents and gracing us, this community, with which you have a connection, a distant connection anyway, about her and him and their story. And you're here to make a presentation about their history and their story and their life. But tell us, first of all, a little bit about you.
Well, I am living in Charleston, South Carolina, but I was born in Atlanta. And at this point in time, I have a passion to finding out all I can about my family. Ellen Wayne Craft is a part of that. And so I've been doing research since the 90s, if not before, going from Florida all the way up to Boston to try to learn more about them. And it's so amazing to actually find letters that they wrote and just think, my goodness, this is something that they actually touched, and to see the actual original documents that have been used for people to write about them. So I'm in awe. And our family, has kept in touch with the descendants of those who have lived in England, and of course we keep in touch with our family that's between Charleston and California. So right now I'm focusing on my family and also other projects that I'm involved in, and part of that is early child education.
Oh, that's outstanding. That's outstanding. Now, it is such an intriguing story. The young man or the lady who wrote the article in the Telegraph, they say it's almost like a spy thriller. The kind of changes they went through and how they almost got caught. And just for those who don't know, just give us kind of an overview of this great story.
Yeah, it's Ellen did not want to have children born into slavery, and so her husband, had the siblings pulled from him, and so she just did not want to lose any children. And so they kept trying to figure out. They didn't want to stay, living under the hand of their masters. They had to figure out, how are we going to get free? They had a privileged life because she was the house servant, and he was able to have his own business and make money, but still give it to his owner. So in the end, they found an idea, because at Christmas time, people are pretty lenient. They're lax in being vigilant about making sure everybody's where they're supposed to be. So they got passes to go visit their family, which is something that does happen. So they were able to, they realized that in 8 days they had the idea for the escape, and they had to execute it by Christmas Day. Because the day after Christmas they would have been looking for them if they had escaped. And so they did. So they were able to, they had a plan developed where Ellen, because she was so fair, because her father was the plantation owner, was her master, and then her mother was also a fair-skinned woman of color, and so she looked so fair, so white, that when she, as a child, would be there playing with the owner's children, people thought that was the child of the master and his wife,
Right.
which was very embarrassing to the master's wife. So in the end, she was given as a gift to the half sister when she married. So Ellen ended up being, as an 11-year-old, she ended up moving from Clinton to Macon. But back to the escape. So here we are, 8 days. They have an idea, and so they develop on Wednesday. From Wednesday to Sunday, they travel for 4 days. And what they did was they dressed her up as a. They knew that a white female traveling around the country would be very suspect with a male African American slave, and so they ended up cutting her hair, making her be a gentleman, a white gentleman. So they cut her hair, so it was more of a Dutch bob, very short, and she made trousers, and they bought a beaver hat, a top hat. They also, because they had some money saved up, he was able to go get the rest of the outfit, but they put green glasses on because that way you couldn't see the fear in her eyes, and because neither of them could read or write, so they had her right arm on a sling, so they could get by without being able to write. And then because she didn't have a beard, so she had like an impacted tooth, so they had a wrap around her head. So she was so covered up that they saw her as an invalid. So she became Mr. Johnson that night or that morning when they stepped out of their place where they had been. And she became Mr. Johnson, and that was his slave. William was his slave. And so they were able to go by train they trained from Macon down to Savannah, and a steamship from Savannah to Charleston. And can you imagine, you can't read or write, and you get off the steamship and you're asking where's the best hotel in the city? And so they ended up going to what was then called Planter's Inn, but that's now in Charleston, Dock Street Theater. That building has been transformed several times. So then they were just there in Charleston for a very brief time because they found there was a boat going to Wilmington. They went to Wilmington, and then they got transportation over to from Wilmington. They eventually got over to Baltimore, and then they had close calls in Charleston and in Baltimore where they wanted proof that this was her slave, or this was Mr. Johnson's slave. So in the end, they really had a favor with people who saw them or people who took pity for this invalid. So in the end, they were able to get across into Philadelphia, where they were able to, that was the first state they could get into that was a free state. And that was such a relief for Ellen to be able to, because she did not want to be dressed as a man. A lot of pressure for 4 days. And so she was able to take all this off, put on her clothes, and then they started meeting. The word got out. They found the name of a boarding house that was one owned by an abolitionist. So they were there, and the word got out among the community of abolitionists in the Philadelphia area about the Ellen and William Craft story. It was amazing. So in the end, they ended up going over to, because it wasn't safe in the city, they went to a Quaker farm where they stayed for about 3 weeks before moving on to Boston. And they weren't even safe there. So after the fugitive slave law was passed, the president was getting ready to send federal troops in to get them arrested, to be taken back to their owners. They didn't need Ellen and William Craft. They owned slaves, but this was a test case to see if this was going to actually be enforced. So the word got out in the paper that the president was sending 600 federal troops to come get Ellen and Wayne Craft.
Now you mean, was that law passed just to catch them?
No, it was passed because a lot of the slave owners were tired of all their slaves escaping, and then they had nobody to help them get them back. Which is why a lot of times the slaves didn't stop in Massachusetts. They kept on going to Canada. And not until they really got to Canada did they really feel safe. And so they were not safe in, Ellen Wayne Craft were not safe in Boston. So they ended up getting help. They had one of the abolitionists from Great Britain was visiting, and they agreed to help them. And so they got sponsored letters, and they went over to England. They landed in Liverpool. They were there for a little bit, and then they ended up living in Surrey for a while they were in a school there. They were teaching as apprentices, and they were learning how to read and write. So not until they got to England, were they really safe. And that's when they started their family.
Now, how many children did they have?
They had 5 children. They had 4 boys and 1 girl.
Now, I noticed in the research that many of them were not called Crafts. Well, maybe it was, but I just...
Well, the firstborn was not named after William. The firstborn was Charles Estelin Phillips Craft, named after very close friends of theirs who were the Estelins, who were their first English friends.
Okay.
And then there was Wendell Phillips, who also had, his name was also inserted in the middle there. So Charles Craft was the firstborn. And then they also had, then the next child was William Craft. So he was named after his father, William Craft.
Right. But their last name was Craft.
Definitely Craft.
For all of them, yeah.
Right.
Well, that's interesting. Now, which one was your great-great-grandmother?
Well, they had 1 daughter and 4 boys, and the firstborn was my grandmother's father. So the firstborn was who my family descended from.
Right.
So Charles Craft. So what's really interesting is that when they came back to live in America, they brought these 5 children who had never been to America. So they're coming to America for the very first time. Civil War is over. They're British accents, and they had never seen any of them. They've heard about America, but they had never seen it. You can imagine growing up in England. And I know for sure our ancestor Charles Craft, he knew French. He also had been traveling in Europe. He knew classical music. I mean, he was very well educated. So he got to this country probably when he was about 17. Around
now that's your great grandfather.
That's my great grandfather.
Okay, all right.
So his child, he married. He was descendants of slaves, which was Ellen Wayne Craft, and he married a woman in Charleston who was free. Her people were always where they were free for generations.
Right.
And we can go back to 1780s when her great grandfather was probably born. The point is that so Charles Craft was my grandmother's grandfather.
Okay.
No, actually, Charles Craft was Ellen Wayne Craft were the grandparents of my grandmother.
Right.
And their son Charles Craft was actually my grandmother's father.
Right. Well, so how did you do all that? I want you to tell me the process of doing all that research. It seems very interesting and very intriguing, and we'll talk about that after we take a break. We'll be right back. This is a call to action.
A call to action.
I'm your host, Alex Halversham, interviewing Miss Julia Ellen Craft Davis. We'll be right back. In Central Georgia, it's that time again for the publication of the new 2015-16 Macon Middle Georgia Black Page. So you want to be a part of it because the theme is Make More Green in 2015. Call today, 478-464-0074, and find out how we can help you make more green in 2015. So I think that we need to take a moment to recognize that, in observing African American or Black history, whatever you call it, it should not be just for a minute. We need to try to concentrate on and understand, what really happened to us historically. And then I think we ought to make a commitment, and a pledge to try to improve, much like what Miss Julia Ellen is doing, because she thinks it's important, not only for personal reasons, but for the community and for African Americans and the world to know, what her great-grandparents did and how important it is to the community. So I just encourage everybody to look at Black history, but do it for more than just one reason. Let it serve as a source of motivation to do something good and to help make Ellen and William Craft proud. How did you? Why you look like that?
Oh, that's very very well spoken, and that's exactly right.
Yeah.
There are a lot of lessons in their story that can be applied today. Education was really important to them.
That's right, because when she had that bandage on her arm because she could not write. But I understand you saying that after having gone to England, and let me tell you something, I really think that it's important as it relates to encouraging our young people, to be educated. You know what I'm saying? Now here this lady is a slave and she was a grown woman, before she could learn to read or write. But then after 20 years in England, or however long it was, she came back lecturing and had been educated and stuff like that.
Yeah, she started learning how to, they had learned the alphabet before they left, but they started learning how to read. They started that process when they were with the Quakers outside of Philadelphia. So, you can't get that in 3 weeks. And so they began it, but they really became accomplished when they were able to go to that school outside of, that was in England, in that Surrey area of England. So they learned, and they learned it so well that William Craft wrote a book in the 1860s about their escape.
Wow.
And it was a well-written book that tells their story. And that's really how a lot of information, about them, is the family has, because we learned it from the book that was printed, and then it was reprinted again in America, during our lifetime. It's been reprinted, 2 or 3 times in our lifetime. So we're able to really have that story. It's online now. So the book is called Running 1,000 Miles by William Craft, and it's online, and it's at the UNC Chapel Hill, as well as University of Virginia. One could read it for free.
Running 1,000 Miles.
Right.
By William Craft.
Right.
And if he could run 1,000 miles to be free, certainly we can run 100 miles to be responsible and educated and citizens who contribute to our society. Well, I don't envy you. I admire you, for having the ambition and the drive and the dedication to just learn all of this information. And I understand that now you do not know where she's buried.
We don't know the exact spot where she was buried, but we know that she wanted to be buried under her favorite tree, which was on the property that they owned when they moved back to the States after the war. So it was, they bought this land called Woodville Plantation, where they wanted to have a school for the children, who had just been free, of the families that had been free from slavery.
Now you talking about they wanted to,
they came back.
They that far from slavery, but they had the drive and the ambition after being free to come back and make a contribution.
Exactly. And it would have been a lot easier to stay in England.
Yes.
A lot.
Yeah.
So they got a place. It was in the North Carolina area, but it was burned by the KKK. Then they went down to Bryan County, which is outside of Savannah, and that's where they got land, and they They ended up having a school there in the barn. They had a place for itinerant preachers, and she also gave lessons to women who were in housekeeping, how to take care of a home, because they had all been slaves, and now they have to learn some new skills here.
Okay, now how did
So in terms of where she was buried, we know that she was buried on that property under her favorite tree. But when her son went down to place the monumental stone, he couldn't find where his mother was buried. She lived her last year or two was in Charleston with her husband. They moved to Charleston with their daughter and her husband, who was Dr. Crum. And they ended up, both of them died in Charleston. And so William was buried in Charleston. We know where he was buried. But Ellen, we don't know where she was buried. We know that her son came back with the stone to place it, and he couldn't find her burial spot. And I've been to the spot. I've been to that property to look for it, and I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep looking. If she was buried under her favorite tree, then it would not have been where the other African Americans are buried, which is really across the road from where their property was.
Right.
But there are people there that might know, and I'm still working on that part. Yes, that's part of the research.
Now what happened to the property? I mean, of course, the property is still there. What happened to the school and the property?
Well, that became a painful story because they ended up losing that property, and the neighbors weren't all that happy with what they were doing. So there was a case that was charged against William, and so Ellen had to try to defend him and testify. And so basically they ended up losing it. But they moved on up to Charleston just before that did happen. And so that was not a joyful thing, but they came back and they helped the people in that community. They did do that, and that speaks volumes to try to have a school. And because of that, they ended up because of that value for education, their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, they all went on, they went on to be educated really well. I mean, his Ellen Wainecraft's son, Charles, had 3 children, and one of them went to Harvard.
Ooh.
And his sister, my grandmother, went to Howard and finished in 1917, and the brother went to Morehouse. Unfortunately, he died from scarlet fever, so he didn't finish, but he would have finished at Morehouse. But they have other family members who have all gone on to college and done some of the best schools in our country. The emphasis on education has been valued in the family, generation to generation.
And I understand that you have a special affinity for education.
Yes. Well, I ended up going on to college in Boston. Our family seems to like to go to college in Boston, which is actually where their daughter went to go to school when she came back to this country. She finished her education in Boston. But I ended up focusing my whole career on the early childhood level, which is really focusing it really on the preschool level. So I've been involved in that years ago as a teacher, but also now more so as an administrator, and now currently working to help our state of South Carolina. I'm on the board with South Carolina First Steps.
That's outstanding. Very quickly, talk a little about the process, because I think many of us could be better motivated if in fact we could study more of our history and about our ancestors. Let me say this, and we might run it real tight, but Julie Allen, I think we all have a responsibility. When we hear stories like what your great-great-grandparents did, and the descendants. It seems to me that ought to motivate us as a people, to not let all of that living and suffering and training and helping be in vain. So I just admire you, for telling the story, and I know that you feel the same way as it relates to, well, let's just try to keep the legacy alive, and let's understand the responsibility that we have as descendants of slaves, to understand what they went through and to try to acknowledge that by trying to improve our situation and our race. So I'm going to give you the last minute to kind of wrap it up.
Well, in terms of researching to find out about your family, we were lucky because we had a book that really helped a lot. But for other people, we're moving into a time where a lot of information is being digitized, and so we're always encouraging people to turn in their family papers, because as this gets turned in to places where African American papers are kept, then you're able to, some of that gets digitized, and you're able to see it. Like the Low Country digitized library, is a name similar to that, that's down. It covers not just South Carolina, but it covers Georgia and a little, maybe Florida, but it covers more than just one state. And you can go online there. There are places where you can go online to get information. I have gone to the library in Georgetown to get information about one of my other ancestors, to see, well, how do I know which how they related to the plantation owner? Which showed that they showed the people that were there. They didn't have the names, but they showed there were 2 people of color living on this particular plantation in Georgetown, South Carolina. And then 10 years later, they weren't there. But I also know the date of my ancestors that would have fit that period.
Right.
So now I have some more to go on.
Right.
The point is, it's like being a detective. So you have to dig and don't get impatient for all the options. Avery Resource Center in Charleston, South Carolina, it has information for people in South Carolina, but also elsewhere. I mean, like, there are people who may have started in South Carolina, but they live elsewhere now in our country. So Avery is amazing. And also the Schomburg in New York. Across our country, there are places one can go and look. You just got to get started, because one thing will lead to another. And I've been to library up in Boston to find things on the crafts, as well as talking to a gentleman at a university down in Florida. I mean, I've been a lot of places, and here in Macon, looking at the microfilm of the old newspapers. It's exciting.
Yeah, I can tell you're very excited. And we too are excited for having you here. Welcome to our city. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is a call to action.
A call to action.
I'm your host, Alex Haversham. Have a great day.